Grant Robertson.
Mr Chair, I was momentarily distracted by some news about one of our parliamentary colleagues, Mr Banks, which I'm sure another colleague will confirm shortly, but seems he may have seen the light for once. Mr Chair, I want to speak on part one of this bill. As my colleague... yes, that's right, Mr Mallard. I want to carry on from where my colleague Claire Curran left off to talk particularly about a variety of matters within the interpretation section, section 3 of the bill. But before I do that, Mr Chair, I want to set the context for those interpretations, and that is provided by the purpose section, which is section 5 of the bill. And the purpose of the bill is in relation of this act is in relation to interception capability. And it is to ensure that surveillance agencies are able to effectively carry out the lawful interception of telecommunications under an interception warrant or any other lawful interception authority. That's the first purpose of this Act. Now, that may sound innocuous, Mr Chair, to people listening to the House today, but the reality, and the Minister says quietly under her breath it is, except it isn't. And it isn't because of legislation that has previously been passed in this House, and that is the GCSB legislation. And it is worth, in the context of Part 1, traversing the fact that the surveillance agencies that have been referred to, just for the benefit of the House, John Banks has resigned as a minister, but he's still the MP for Epsom, so I'm sure the people of Epsom are very grateful for that. Purpose 5A of this bill is to ensure that the surveillance agencies, such as the GCSB, can carry out the interception that they are entitled to do under law. That right for the GCSB was vastly expanded under the GCSB bill. And it is not right to simply say that this is an innocuous provision, as the Minister has tried to claim, when in reality the very surveillance agencies that are covered by this legislation have had their powers expanded. And the way in which those powers have been expanded primarily relates to the ability to spy on New Zealanders. It also, the GCSB legislation expanded the ways in which that surveillance could take place. But it is essential to know that one of the main reasons that the Labour Party has a problem with this legislation is that it is the legislation that operationalises the GCSB Act. The widened powers, the ability to spy on New Zealanders has in this bill life. And we believe that that legislation that was passed by this Parliament is deeply flawed, fails to strike the correct balance between protecting the security interests of New Zealand and also giving New Zealanders the freedom to operate. That balance has been lost, Mr Chair. It has now been totally lost from the intelligence agencies in New Zealand, and here we have a bill that puts that into practice, and Mr Speaker, that's why the purpose of this bill in Section 5 is wrong. So what the purpose then goes on to do is talk about network operators and service providers having the freedom to choose to design system design features and specifications that are appropriate for their own purposes. Let's just read that again. Network operators and service providers have the freedom to choose system design features and specifications that are appropriate for their own purposes. Well, I'm sorry to say, the bill doesn't achieve that purpose, because all of the network operators and service providers who came to the Select Committee said that's the very thing they now won't be able to do, because the government is now going to be involved in the design of their networks. The government's going to be able to have a say in how those networks operate. The government's going to be able to monitor those networks. So Purpose 5C in Part 1 is completely impossible under the rest of this bill. And it's not just opposition politicians who are saying this, Mr Speaker. Members of Parliament have all received an open letter from the NZ Rise group. And in that open letter, they are pleading with the government, don't rush this legislation through. The government hasn't thought it through properly. The people, the service providers and the network operators who this law affects are saying, we're not clear what it means. The lawyers that those people have consulted are not clear what it means. The Minister keeps saying, well, we know what it means. But the very people who it affects are not able to interpret this law clearly. They are calling on the government to say, This law does not reflect the purpose in Section 5. If the purpose is to allow network operators to have the freedom to choose system design features, Mr Chair,
The Honourable Member Grant Roberts.
then that is exactly what the rest of the law should do, and it does not. So, Mr Chair, we regard that the purpose section sounds good when you read it on a superficial level, but in terms of 5A around surveillance agencies and in 5C around network operators, the rest of the bill fails to allow those purpose clauses to come into action. Mr Chair, I then want to refer back to the question of who is a network operator and who is a service provider, and that is dealt with for us in Section 3 of the bill. And as my colleague Claire Curran has already made clear, the definition of network operator is now potentially so broad as to include just about anybody. It could include your local school. I was just down in the press gallery a few minutes ago discussing the matter of John Banks and his political life, and I looked around the Fairfax office. Banks, that's right, the very short political life remaining for John Banks, and I looked around the Fairfax office and I said, well, you're a network operator, I think. I've just had a look at the bill and you're a network operator. Well, that's true. That's true. In deference to some of the staff members in the Fairfax office, they've already experienced what this bill is going to be allowed. It is how they lost Peter Dunn as well. But that, in all seriousness, they are, under the definition here, potentially a network operator. That is a farcical situation, Mr Chair, for a piece of legislation to come to this House with a definition of network operator that could take into account schools, take into account offices. It is the kind of loose legislation that this government unfortunately is renowned for, and it should not be going through this House. And I refer again, Mr Chair, to the open letter from NZ Rise, and they have said, I think, a very interesting statement here. They've said the bill places onerous obligations upon network operators. That term is defined through a tangled web of definitions drawn from the Telecommunications Act and then amended. And Mr Chair, I could not agree more with that statement. They go on to say the definition's second limb specifies that a network operator is a person who supplies, whether by wholesale or retail, another person with the capability to provide a communications service. If you then add in all of the other definitions, it is essentially anybody who is supplying another person with the capability to provide goods, services and equipment that enable or facilitate the conveyance of, by electromagnetic means from one device to another, of any encrypted or non-encrypted sign. Just pause there at that point. Trevor Mallard is a network operator. That's a frightening thought for all of us. Trevor Mallard is a network operator. We are all under this potentially network operators because the conveyance by electromagnetic means from one device to another of any encrypted or non-encrypted signs, if we enable that, when a parent sets up a network inside their home for their children to be a part of, they are now captured by this definition of network operator that is here. That, Mr Chair, is a farcical situation to have a definition like that. I'm not suggesting for it necessarily that the Minister's intention is to capture a family's network at home, but it's clearly poorly drafted in that regard. Or if it isn't, and that is the Minister's intention, then all of the fears that New Zealanders have about the expansion of powers of surveillance agencies have come to pass. So that is why we have an SOP to change, to revise the definition around network operator. We need to ensure that New Zealanders have the freedom to communicate with one another in the way that we do in the modern world. That means law that is appropriate, that balances the need for security and the freedoms and rights of New Zealanders. The definition of network operator that is contained within Part 3 of this bill, Mr Chair, is woefully inadequate. It is far too broad. It captures far too many New Zealanders. It creates enormous uncertainty among the public and among the telecommunications industry, and the Minister must change that definition. The other definitions that we've got particular concern about within within this Part 3 includes the question of service providers. And there was in fact an addition in the Select Committee to say that a service provider means anyone from within or outside New Zealand providing or making available in New Zealand a telecommunications service. This is an enormously wide definition of what a service provider is, taking into people not only in New Zealand but outside New Zealand. I'm not even sure the law can do this, Mr Chair, and I think that clause should also be altered.
I call the Honourable Member Tracy Martin.
Kia ora, Mr Chair.